on how I have learned. Again, we can divide this into the normal methods by which all animals learn, including human animals, and it doesn't separate me off at all from anyone else. And that is that we learn, as David Hume pointed out, through experience, through our senses, through what comes in through our eyes and ears and mouth, nose, and our feelings. And in that way, I learned most of what I know without being really conscious of it. It went straight from my senses into my mind, which organized it and picked out bits and connected other bits. And so I learned 90% of what I know intuitively, as all animals do, including humans, as I mentioned. But that takes us to childhood through childhood. But from childhood onwards, I started to learn in more specialist ways, which are not universal. One obviously was going to school, and from my first kindergarten at 5 or 6, and before from informal teaching by my ayahs in India and my parents, I was being schooled. And so my long progression of education, formal education, was really significant, central part of my formal learning. A number of people who've looked back on their education in their later lives, who don't have the kind of detailed documentation that I have, tend to think of it often as a very negative period, a time when their curiosity was stunted and they learnt practically nothing. Two well-known examples. One is the education of Henry Adams, an American autobiography, which is really fascinating, but he dismisses all that he learnt, more or less, until the end of his time at Harvard University, and said it was after that that he really began to learn. And another example is Descartes, who said that all his time at school and university was a waste of time, and then he began to learn. And a third example is Einstein, who says more or less the same thing. I think if they'd had the material and thought a bit more carefully about it, they realised this was nonsense. It's true that they had to break away from their learning and learn afresh and relearn and unlearn. All that is true, but without the previous actual learning, it was like any sport, game, art. You have to learn how to play tennis or play the piano or play chess or whatever. You have to learn the rules, you have to learn the basic techniques and methodology, reading, writing, arithmetic, even that, because without that you can't progress and unlearn things. So those formal years, and they were very extended for me. I chose to extend them, and I was at a time of fortunate economic growth when it was possible to do so. So from kindergarten at 5 or 6, through my primary school, my preparatory school from 8 to 13, my public school from 13 to 18, my undergraduate degree at Oxford from 18 to 21, my DPhil at Oxford from 21 to 25, my master's at the London School of Economics from 25 to 27, and my second doctorate at the School of Oriental and African Studies from 27 to 30. And even then, I went on to a research fellowship, which was another non-teaching job, and explicitly about researching and learning. So I had at least 30 years of almost pure learning, and nothing much else calling on my time, which was absolutely wonderful. It was I built up a vault of gold and treasure on which to draw for the rest of my life. But that was one side, that formal learning, which is the reading, the lectures, the excellent teaching that I got from a series of very gifted teachers throughout my school days and at university. That is the formal learning. And then from then on, I learnt in many different ways. One was from my students. As a teacher at Cambridge for 40 years or so, I learnt a huge amount from both my undergraduates, who were the best in the country, and from my graduate students, masters and PhD students, a huge amount, partly from them and partly from having to explain to them and talk to them. It was an endless, long, arduous, often tiring, sometimes occasionally boring conversation, from which I learnt a great deal. Then obviously from my colleagues, I had some of the most gifted historians, anthropologists and others around me in Cambridge for many years, as I had in Oxford before. And from them I learnt a vast amount, and particularly from my mentors like Jack Goody and Edward Evans Pritchard and Ernest Gellner and Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf and others. And then enormously from my friends. I've had the good fortune to have dozens of really good friends, and among them there have been a handful who I've got very, very close to. Several of them in the West, particularly Jerry Martin, who I befriended when I was 50, and for about 14 years we were like older and younger brother, and I talked about anthropology and he talked about technology and science and business, and he was just an example of such kind of friendly learning. And there were half a dozen others very close over my life. And then there were my girlfriends, and from my first girlfriend, a Hungarian girl, when I was just 18 or 19, through a series of girlfriends, and then obviously to my first wife and to my second wife Sarah, and pausing on Sarah because from her I must have learnt more than from any other living individual. We've been a partnership for 50 years, and it's been an intensely close, cooperative, collaborative relationship from which every day I learn new things. And then from my family, hugely in my case, above all from my mother, who was a great teacher in her way and interested in everything, a polymath, a gifted artist, a philosopher, a writer, historian, and a left-wing Buddhist sort of person, and who took immense trouble with me writing long letters every week. And from her I was launched on my career of learning, and also by my grandmother, her mother, who largely brought me up and who was a great force for pushing me on towards knowledge, and from my young uncle Robert, who for about 10 years lived with us, was only 8 years older than me, and from him he later became a distinguished historian and member of parliament and so on. So I learnt from my family, and in terms of friendship I learnt above all in other societies from several very deep friendships. In Japan, from two Japanese scholars, Toshiko and Kanichi, and a long friendship formed over 15 years, during which we really began to understand each other and write a book on Japan together. And in Nepal, a number of really very deep friendships, which have continued, some of them to this day, and above all the one with my adopted or half-sister, Dilmaya Gurung, who became one of my really closest friends. And then I learnt in China from a series of really close friendships. I won't name names, but they will know who they are. A dozen or so really close Chinese friends, and friends in other parts of the world, in France, in America. And each friendship has enriched me enormously, as have some of my other relatives, particularly my two granddaughters, above all Lily, with whom I became close friends from as soon as she could speak, until her teenage years, and she began to make her own life. And I've learnt an enormous amount from travelling. There's travelling and travelling. My kind of travelling is going to places, but trying to learn as much as possible from them, whether it's just a week in Florence or Venice, or 17 visits to China, 20 visits to Nepal, and long periods of immersion. And in each case, I try to get inside as far as one can in a culture where one often doesn't know much about the history and nothing about the language. Something, through the help of people there and keeping your eyes open and comparing it to other things, try to learn, expand my worlds. And finally, there are many other forms of learning, but just to wind up, there's also teaching. And in teaching, I don't just mean lecturing and supervising and those kinds of teaching, but also teaching through writing, because I've discovered something which was not really explained to me, which is that the best way to learn about a subject is to either teach it or to write about it or to speak about it, as I'm now doing, because then you very soon encounter the limits of your knowledge. You have to explore and fill in gaps. You have to order your thoughts. And above all, you have the joy in moments of creative writing or lecturing, when you make new connections and you discover new things which you had half known but had not connected in your mind. And suddenly, it's like doing a jigsaw. Suddenly the bits fit together and you see the connections. So a life of writing many books and articles, giving many lectures, teaching many good students, has been a way of learning as well as passing on what I've learnt elsewhere. And through all those methods, I've learnt what occurs to me is, after all, just a tiny fragment of what there is to know. It's well caught in that famous metaphor of Newton's, arguably the greatest physicist, scientist who's ever lived. And he was asked about how much he knew and where he placed himself. And he said, well, I feel like a little boy standing on the edge of the ocean of knowledge, just casting in a small stone. That's the proportion, he thought, of what there is to know that he knew. And this is part of learning about the world. You learn more and more about how little you do know and how much more there is to discover, which is encouraging, because it would be very boring if you sat back and said, that's it, I know it all. Thank you.